way I will structure the talk today is to talk a little bit. I have some notes here as an aid to memory. And the way I believe Manthan organizes this is that the speaker speaks for a certain amount of time, 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then it's thrown open to the audience to ask questions. I really can't see you very clearly because of these lights, but if somebody has a question which they feel cannot wait till I finish talking, please raise your hand and I'll elaborate on whatever I said, because as Vikram mentioned, I have covered from 1947 till end May 2019. That means including the results of the last Lok Sabha elections in my book. And that's an immense span of time, and I cover both foreign policy decision making as well as in the economic sphere. Of course, decisions taken at the apex level, at the level of the prime ministers, and some would like to excuse prime ministers from certain decisions on the grounds that it was based on advice from X, Y, or Z. I don't get into those details. If something turned out well, that is to the prime minister's credit. After all, he or she was the head of government, and if something didn't turn out well, that is to the discredit of that particular prime minister. But it is not with a view to finding fault. It is with a view to figuring out what is the way forward. About roughly 2.5 years ago, or maybe a little more, there is a gentleman called Mark Tully who used to be, for those who are younger, you may not have heard of his name, but he was a famous name in Delhi some time back as the head of BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. So he used to write and also speak on BBC Radio. And he asked me at a gathering, some friends had got together to celebrate somebody's birthday, and he said, "What are you working on?" I said, "I've just started working on a book." So he said, "Can you describe to me what this book is all about in one sentence?" So I was mumbling some protests, saying, he said, "No, if you can't describe it in one sentence, then I'm afraid nobody's going to read your book, nobody's interested in your book. So please tell me immediately what your book is about in one sentence." So in one sentence, I don't know whether I can reproduce exactly what sentence I gave him. I said that my book is about how decision making at the apex level of government raised levels of optimism or cynicism among the people at large. He said, "Done, you're okay. You could describe your book in one sentence, so you'll be fine." Now, that's what the book is about, ultimately. And I started with 1947, and you might say, and some of the what I have covered is about Kashmir, and you might say, what are you writing about Kashmir in 47 and what happened? But as we know from recent events in Jammu and Kashmir, it's sometimes necessary to look back to the origins of problems, to understand them with some depth and with some understanding. For me, in recent decades, it has been quite painful to watch the cynicism that often pervades campaigning during Indian elections and subsequent government formation, as we saw recently in Maharashtra, particularly if no one party gets an absolute majority. And this is an oft-repeated cliche, but somehow we have to retain our optimism. I don't know how, but somehow we have to manage to retain our optimism. I say this because I find that average persons of this country, despite much evidence to the contrary, they go and vote, and again and again and yet again, they have delivered India from the personal interest-driven actions of those in positions of authority. It is for this reason that my book is peppered with cartoons, I think at least one per chapter, R.K. Lakshman cartoons. Those who are younger perhaps would not know. He was a very famous cartoonist when I was young. And he used to have a common man and a common lady in his cartoons. So they look bemused at the actions of political leaders. And it is that common man that, for whatever reason, in aggregate, this country has been fortunate to have. Their patience, despite so much evidence for them to become impatient. I'm abstracting from the odd riot here or that problem somewhere else. I'm speaking to you in English, and this book is written in English. Why? Because I grew up in an English medium school and college in Delhi. And although at home we used to speak my mother tongue, which is Assamese, but my Assamese is not good enough to write a book of this length. And therefore my book is accessible to a very low percentage of Indians. I mean, we can keep arguing whether it is 8, 6, 10, but it is more than 90% of the people in this country cannot read a book of this length, which is written in English. So I will try, I will check with Ajay as well as with Vikram if there is some way to have this book translated into Telugu. I'm also exploring in Delhi how to get it translated to Hindi and so on. You know, the knowledge of English has set a certain section of the elite in affluent urban India apart from what is nowadays called in some sections the real India, which is Bharat. My own feeling is that these two groups, Bharat group will be much larger than India if you define Indians as those who can speak, read and write in English. I don't think they should view each other with suspicion. I think the English-speaking elite needs to know at least one Indian language very well. And they also need to be mindful, because some within or among my acquaintances, I don't see them that concerned, and I don't blame them because everybody is busy with their own personal lives, about the socially and economically disadvantaged sections. At the same time, those elements among what I have called vernacular Bharat, they sometimes exult about some kind of an idealized, and I suspect possibly some kind of mythical golden past about ancient India. And whether that is true or not, they need to stop engaging in inverse snobbery. As far as India's future is concerned, I'm reminded of a country called Argentina. In a way, it's a very representative example of a country with a lot of promise, and this is at the beginning of the 20th century. And in the last 100 years, it's yet again in economic difficulties if you are following events in Latin America in general and Argentina in particular. They've just mismanaged their politics and their economics. India has a large market, and hopefully with the implementation of GST getting better, making it easier in terms of the input of data so that people can get their refunds in time. That is one of the complaints. Hopefully with time it'll get better. And then as we become more integrated as one market, although sometimes one hears views of some people who hold political office about, this state only people from that state are allowed to work and so on. Hopefully those kinds of views will be overridden by more rational views. But I would be wary of assuming that, there is some kind of preordained greatness for India. That in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we will be a great country. We have to work every day. As all of us who have gone through school know, you can't prepare for your exam 24 hours, 48 hours, or even 1 week before the exam takes place. You work through the year, you attend the lectures, you do your homework, and then you do well. Similarly, for a country, we have to work every day, we have to work steadily, and we have to work in a coherent way. Now, why did I write this book? There are so many biographies, there are so many books about India's past, and there are detailed studies on independent India, and so on. But to the best of my knowledge, there are very few books that speak about the causalities of PM-level decisions and the subsequent consequences with sufficient frankness. Some who have served in government claim that they made it a point to speak truth to power. I worked in government, so I've rarely seen officials or ministers, there are rare occasions, when people in the office or later in their writings, when they were not in government, speak truth to power. On the contrary, there are many examples of those who have chosen to lose our respect by prostrating themselves in front of a feudal and entitlement-infected political culture. And unfortunately, this is usually done in the name of humility and self-effacement. Just as an aside, every number and factoid in my book has been cross-referenced and cited in the notes, which are listed by number and chapter at the end of the book. I personally would have preferred to put them on each page wherever the number is cited, but Penguin felt that it is very difficult for the average reader. They feel the book is too technical if there are too many footnotes, because sometimes there are as many as 2 or 3 on a page. So I deferred to their better judgment. Unfortunately, my wife could not come today. She had another commitment. She would have loved to be here in Hyderabad with you all. So even in her absence, I want to thank her, because without her support and encouragement, I think it's important to thank those who are close to you. This book just would not have been possible. To just give an instance about her support and including intellectual inputs, I don't know if everybody is familiar. There is a place called Mukteshwar in Uttarakhand. It's a hill station, and we were driving back from there. And the discussion was about how to compare prime ministers across time. How do you compare Nehru, say, with Narasimha Rao? The country is different, the challenges are different, the issues are different, the kind of resources that the Prime Minister had, both material and human, are very different. So as we were driving, we decided that maybe we look at personal characteristics. And in the book, right through the book, for each Prime Minister, I tried to give my understanding about their character, competence, and charisma. And character, by definition, is not 33%. Without character, any amount of competence or charisma means nothing. And character includes compassion. At this stage, I'd like to talk a little bit about the various chapters to give you a flavor of what the book is about and what I feel. For instance, I spoke about Kashmir, I spoke about 47. Nowadays it's quite fashionable in some circles to blame Nehru for everything. Poor man is dead more than 50 years ago, and it's very convenient. He is at the root of all our problems, economic, foreign policy, etc., etc. Let's take Kashmir, because I'm also an ex-foreign service officer. So look at Kashmir. The point is repeatedly made about how he made wrong decisions. It's possible. I mean, he was human. But let's look at the armed incursion of so-called Pakistani irregulars, including tribesmen, and how we didn't face up to them the way we should have. One little factoid. Till early 1948, the Indian Army was commanded by British officers. There was a commander-in-chief and there was a field marshal. It's all explained in my book. And under the Independence of India Act, which was passed, obviously not in our parliament, but in the British Parliament, the Governor-General had a preeminent role even after India had a Prime Minister. But he's supposed to be in India for 6 months except under certain kinds of specific circumstances. So the Governor-General was also chairman of the Defense Committee. The Prime Minister now is the chairperson of all important committees, including those for security and economic affairs and so on. But at that point of time, the Defense Committee was headed by Lord Mountbatten. Now, I'm sure this is a very specialized audience and many of you would know all this, but some among the younger may not know that. Now, what about the Air Force? Why didn't we use the Air Force? The Air Force was commanded by a British Air Force officer. It was known as the Royal Indian Air Force till when? If I ask that question in a GK exam to, there's one young gentleman who told me that he has appeared for the UPSC till 1954. We were the Royal Indian Air Force, not the Indian Air Force. Till when was our Navy commanded by a British officer? Till 1958. All this to point out that Nehru had limitations. He had a defense committee chaired by Lord Mountbatten. The 3 wings of the armed forces were commanded by British officers. The British High Commissioners in Delhi and Lahore, because that's where the capital was at that time, not Lahore, pardon me, Karachi, were in touch with each other, because now some of those documents have been declassified by the British government. And their advice had everything to do with British interest and very little to do with Indian or Pakistani interest. Although the Second World War had already indicated that petroleum is going to become very valuable, because the Air Force, the impact of the use of Air Force in the Second World War had convinced the developed countries of the world that petroleum will be a vital resource because it's required for fighter planes and bombers in large quantities. And therefore, we will not go there, but therefore the Persian Gulf region and what is today Saudi Arabia, which we call West Asia, became very important. And to that extent, Pakistan became important as also a possible base. But coming back to Kashmir and coming back to our dependence, I have listed in the book the defense equipment that the Indian Army had. Practically everything we had was from the UK. So if they squeeze the supply line for spares, you could say we have stocks of spares. We have some spares. You are in trouble. Your army is in trouble. Those of you who are old enough to have visited Kolkata 30, 40 years ago Even 30, 40 years ago, not 70 years ago, practically every lift or elevator, choose your word, you will see made in Scotland, made in UK, and so on. The Indian High Commission in London, which I headed some time back, had 1,500 employees in 1947 when Krishna Menon became High Commissioner. Why did it have 1,500 employees? You don't need 1,500 diplomats. Most of them were in the supply wing of the Indian High Commission. All this to give you a sense of our dependence on the UK. If you've got all your heavy machinery, all your heavy military equipment from that one country, you need to get spares and further supplies from there. And to that extent, this stuff about how Nehru took the Kashmir dispute to the United Nations, yes, it is a mistake. And perhaps he had some way of refusing to do that, but there was tremendous British pressure. And when you can use your clout as a supplier of so many of the vital necessities for a newly independent country, not everything has to be spelt out in words, an indication. So therefore, I'm not sticking up for Nehru and nor am I an apologist for him. I'm saying read for yourself. I have footnotes there which give you more reading, not just my book, to give you a sense of how it was not the country it is today. Was there any India ever in history? Never, with the kind of geographical contours that we have today. There was no India, not even in the time of Ashok. Started out with Kaling, and he went further west up to Afghanistan, but not southern India. And definitely, I mean, you can imagine you have to go on horseback. How can you retain complete control over far-flung parts? So you are starting off with a new country. And he was 58 years old at that time. And last but not the least, for those who come up with this difference or differences between Sardar Patel and how he wrote this famous letter on China. I'll come in a moment to China. As you all know, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated on 30th of January 1948 in what is known as Birla House in Delhi. That road is now called 30 January Marg. As it happens, Sardar Patel, as the then Home Minister, was with Gandhi for about 1.5 hours. He left and then Gandhi got up and went for his evening prayers. We are all familiar with the hymns he liked. And every year on 30th of January, those hymns are sung in that location. And we all know who shot him, and we don't have to go into those controversies of those who think that he was a great patriot. The point I'm making is that if you are aware of the literature on this, Sardar Patel was attacked all over the country. Nobody talks about that now. Why? Because he was the Home Minister. And the unthinking people around the country, I say unthinking because even if he was Home Minister, he cannot prevent every violent incident, and the point was made that it is not every violent incident. He should have, through using our intelligence agencies, and also had a cordon of security around the Mahatma. Whether that criticism was justified or not, it kept rising in pitch till Nehru wrote an extremely affectionate letter, all there in the public record. I mean, you can just go and get it. And I quote from Sardar Patel's response. For those who make out that these are two leaders who are at loggerheads with each other, one is a very practical, hard-headed, careful man, and the other man is an idealistic man with his head in the clouds. So Nehru wrote this letter to Patel saying that nobody can predict what will happen in a gathering, and you're absolutely not to, my heart goes out to you, and so on and so forth. And Sardar Patel writes back an extremely emotional letter thanking him. I'm just giving you a little snippet there. Now coming to broader issues. I mean, Nehru is seen as somebody who messed up on the economy. he is the reason why we were inward looking, etc., etc. Those of you who are familiar, and I have a little photograph there from Lahore, which a cycle shop, a bicycle shop, on top of the shop it says Buy Swadeshi. I'm sure you are familiar with photographs from that time where the public spirited people were asked to come out to some city and burn all clothes made in the UK. And many from very affluent background took off their Western clothes and burned them on the grounds that all this clothing which is coming from the UK is making our own textile and garment industry totally bereft of customers, and to that extent the slogan was Buy Swadeshi. So therefore some of the import substitution ideas of Nehru and his colleagues, if you look at the 1938 resolution of the Congress Party, they are talking about socialism. So Nehru's socialism has nothing to do with himself alone. It was the entire Congress Party. Now you can find fault with the entire Congress Party, but that Congress Party, by the way, the name Congress should have been retired in 1971 when Mrs. Gandhi formed Congress I. The Election Commission at that time retired the symbol. The Congress Party had a symbol of 2 bullocks, for those who are old enough to remember, and now it is the hand. If you're going to retire the symbol, please retire the name as well, because the subsequent party has nothing to do with the party that fought for Indian freedom. But coming back to import substitution, it had a lot to do with the way, and I must add here that people from affluent circles and well-educated circles were not, in percentage terms, there were obviously examples, like Nehru himself. He came from a very affluent background. He went to study in England. So it is actually the middle, maybe even lower middle class and below, who were there in the freedom struggle in large numbers. And to appeal to them in terms of their future, the Congress Party felt that socialism, they didn't use the word communism, is the way to go. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, many of the policies, including import substitution, were wrong. But what about export pessimism? Some who are economists here would be familiar with the name of Raul Prebisch. He was an Argentinian economist, went on to become Director General of UNCTAD. He wrote a number of scholarly works. But not just him, many economists were convinced that developing countries would always have adverse terms of trade for their exports. They will export raw materials and import finished goods, and to that extent, exports is not necessarily. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we again know that perhaps that was incorrect, but that was the prevailing wisdom. So I personally would not blame Nehru for accepting the prevailing wisdom and at the same time suggesting that perhaps India has to find its own middle path, some other way to develop. And just incidentally, between 1947 and 64, in May, when he passed away, the growth rates were well over 3% on average. Between 1900 and 1947, the growth rate was 0.8%. If you look at sources of revenue, you're essentially land revenue before that, before independence, that is. So again, you had a situation where you have a very rudimentary basic economy in comparative terms to what it is today or even what it was, say, 30 years ago. So I personally don't fault Nehru in my book for some of the mistakes on economic policy making. Funnily enough, Nehru chose to be his own foreign minister all the 17 years that he was prime minister. I think that was a mistake. Took too much time going to UN and spending a month there and so on, because there's a lot of idealism about arguing for the independence of African countries, of Southeast Asian countries, and so on. Taking time away from the vital tasks of development at home. But two mistakes, and I'll move on to others because I'm spending too much time on Nehru. But he is, or was, what he was. And we wouldn't be, and I'll give a quote from the book in a minute. Foreign policy, two big mistakes. China, Aksai Chin, he should have accepted Chou En-lai's offer. I don't know whether it was possible for him to make it fly with his own party, that is the Congress. The Chinese had occupied Aksai Chin. The IB knew, Mr. B.N. Malik, the head of the Intelligence Bureau, knew about it. But I don't know how many of you are aware, you're far away. I'm from Assam, so I'm a little more aware of what was happening in what is today Arunachal Pradesh and Nagaland. Nagaland, or the Naga leaders, did not accept India as a country to which they pertained after independence. They wanted a separate country of their own. I'm guessing, it's not written anywhere, it is pure guesswork. The Nehru was a little nervous about the Chinese stoking up problems for us in the Northeast, and he was prepared to look the other way. There is no way that he did not know when India signed the Trade and Transit Treaty with Tibet in 1954 that the Chinese had already occupied Aksai Chin. The other big mistake on the economic side was not taking more advantage of what the US was offering. I'm sure many of you know that the US had two major air bases in our part of the world, one in Peshawar, what was then in West Pakistan, and the other one in Kumaritola, very close to Dhaka, in what was then East Pakistan. And you are aware of an aircraft called the U-2. The U-2 in those days could fly at 75,000 to 80,000 feet above sea level. And they would mount spying missions out of these two bases. So to that extent, and we won't get into how one was shot down by the Soviets, and then the whole thing became public. But all that was very valuable in an era of the Cold War. And we won't get into CENTO and SEATO and all those treaties. And Nehru was very prescient to keep us out of any of those military pacts. But one could abstract from that and yet respond more favorably to Kennedy's desire, because Kennedy was a Democrat in a true sense of the word. Let's not get into his personal peccadillos. I mean, there are enough written about his flings and so on within inverted commas. But he was genuinely interested in an engagement with India, and he genuinely felt that India's success as a democracy is a great thing for the US, even in its Cold War with the Soviet Union, because here is a democracy of this size which is doing well. And I think Nehru was not sufficiently mindful of the opportunities Kennedy's, of course Kennedy was shot dead, but it could have started and then it might have continued. I'll stop with Nehru at this stage. Shastri, only two lines. He started the Green Revolution, he gave up Haji Pir. One is something we benefited from, and during Indira Gandhi's time, more was done on the Green Revolution. You're all familiar with Norman Borlaug and his magical seeds, which he experimented with in Mexico and so on. And the Operation Flood, which is today we are, I think, the largest producer of milk in the world. It started in Shastri's time. But I think Tashkent, and here I just want to give you my insight as somebody who has spent a long time in government and in foreign affairs. The Soviet Union, I think, behind India's back, was working out some deal with the US for some mutual accommodation, which I can't immediately pinpoint. This is a guess, a hunch, I can't prove it. And they pressurized Shastri to give up Haji Pir Pass, and don't worry if you don't know where it is somewhere what we now call Pakistan occupied Kashmir. It would have given us an advantage, and Kargil may not have happened if we had Haji Pir Pass. But you have to give Shastri credit for having asked the Indian Army to march towards Lahore. That's when they developed cold feet. That is just to give you an insight as to how things happen between countries like India and Pakistan because of two countries which are supposedly at a cold war between each other. But on nuclear matters and certain matters, the Soviet Union and the US would reach accommodation outside of any public site. So keep that in mind even for today. Just when you think that the US and China are at loggerheads, they might work out a deal, and we might be again left gaping at things. Coming to Indira Gandhi, I think this was a very sad part of our history, because she pushed her children, first Sanjay Gandhi and Rajiv, and she had every wrong instinct. She is the person who instituted what I would call a command and control economy, centralized decision making in the Prime Minister's office, and so on. So on the economy, Nehru not so bad, Indira Gandhi very, very bad. The same things that we did in 91, there's no reason for Indira Gandhi not to have done it in 1971. But that required a vision and an understanding of the economy which was beyond her. Can you imagine if we had a 20-year head start? But be that as it may, she did devalue the rupee in 1966, I believe it was. Yes, I think after she took over from Shastri within 5-6 months. And she immediately backtracked after that. She is accused of having made a mess with the nationalization of banks. But those of you who have read the Tandon Committee report and so on, I have mixed feelings about it. The public sector banks have done a lot of good work. If you look at the lending to outside the metros, in the less developed parts of the country, and the bank branches around, the growth of branches in rural and semi-rural areas, I don't think that would have happened without public sector banks at the speed with which it happened. Of course, nowadays, banks say that you don't need brick and mortar banks, you can do everything on the net, but that is today. I mean, it wasn't true in the 70s and 80s or even 90s. At this stage, I'll read out two excerpts from my book. One about Nehru, and then about Narasimha Rao I'll come to later. Each chapter of my book has a legacy section at the end. It is what the Prime Minister inherited and what he bequeathed to his successor. Because, you can be God's gift to humanity and know everything about everything, and plus you have good luck. But depending on what kind of India you inherited, there's only so much you can do. So therefore, you have to talk about what kind of India each Prime Minister inherited and what kind of India that Prime Minister bequeathed to his or her successor. And this is a direct quote from the book. An extremely distressing error that some commentators make is to speak of Nehru and Indira Gandhi in the same breath as the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. The only way Nehru and Indira Gandhi were related was that he was a loving father and she a doting daughter. In everything to do with modes of governance, building of institutions, transparency and personal values, they were as different as day and night. All said and done. Without Nehru at the helm after independence, there may have been a continuing idea of India, but there may not have been an undivided nation state called India today. Rajiv Gandhi, all kudos to him for that fantastic speech he made at the Congress centenary year of 1985. I'm not getting into other issues of Indira Gandhi. I think she dismissed Chief Minister Brahmananda Reddy. Somebody here can correct me, in the early 80s. And she also dismissed or told Mr. Narasimha Rao in the early 70s, when he was Chief Minister of undivided Andhra Pradesh, that although Congress had a majority, that he is no longer chief minister because he was, I think, implementing land ceilings for those who held huge land holdings, and that was getting back to Indira Gandhi as something which would not be sustainable as far as the rich and powerful were concerned. So those kinds of traits Mr. Rajiv Gandhi also picked up, although I must say to his credit, at a personal level he was extremely polite and soft-spoken. But there was some kind of, this is my right. I am Prime Minister by right, and you might say, but if Indira Gandhi was such a disaster as far as the economy is concerned, how did, after her assassination in 1984, why was there such a sympathy wave all over the country and Congress got 405 out of 500 and at that time 36 Lok Sabha seats? I think she had touched a chord in a lot of people. I mean, we can laugh or we can praise the slogan Garibi Hatao, but it did touch a lot of people. And a lot of people had faith in her. Whether she lived up to their faith is another matter. And it's discussed in the book because I don't want to give away everything in the book. Otherwise, there is no interest in reading the book. But unfortunately, she had started this whole dynastic politics, which then kind of spread all over like a virus. It is like one of these Ebola virus. It spread all over the country. To the best of my memory, and again I might be wrong, in terms of the regional politics, this whole business of children of chief ministers and others in power or in prominence, not doing anything except doing a BA and perhaps an MBA from some little known place in the United States or UK, come back and immediately become an MP, MLA, and very soon a minister and so on. And again, I will not give the example of recent events in Maharashtra. Rajiv Gandhi really was not on top of many things, not because of any other reason. He just didn't have the experience. He was an Indian Airlines pilot. Good for him. I mean, I can't fly a plane. He could. So obviously, he knew his job very well. But can you fly the national plane? I mean, I have to be a little careful there because a national plane is a little more complicated than the cockpit of a jet. So he said things which really I felt were the right things. If you go back and read his speech, I think it was December 1985, where he talks about the hypocrisy and the cynicism within political parties, including the Congress, and I felt, my God, here's a young man who's come, he's going to clean up everything and he's going to do this and that. But within no time, everything disappeared. There was Bofors, there was this, there was that, there was Sri Lanka trying to divert attention from Bofors, there was this operation that General Sundarji and Arun Singh mounted on the border with Pakistan. So those of you who are young, in about 400 pages, you'll get a reasonable idea, my idea of what happened, but many facts and notes are there for you to cross-check if I'm making up things. So there are going to be very few books where you get a sense of our economic and foreign policies in just 450 or 470 pages. But here, Rajiv Gandhi changed his foreign minister and his defense minister 5 times in 5 years. Doesn't make any sense. Can you imagine a company which changes its top officials 5 times in 5 years? What kind of a company will that be? Even an average company with 100 crore turnover cannot manage with that kind of change of top management. And here the defense minister, the foreign minister is changing every now and then. Poor Narasimha Rao is shunted from one place to the other. Doesn't say a word. Maybe that's his USP. That is his great magic as he rose to be Prime Minister at a critical point of time. Sri Lanka was a ghastly mess. And the 1,700 Jawans who died in Sri Lanka, I explained in detail why it was totally and completely unnecessary. There are many people in my service and in government who totally disagree with me. They said, no, India has to show its muscle. India has to show who's boss. I mean, they don't say it in as many words like that, crudely, but that's, our neighboring countries must, they know, they're Sri Lanka, I mean, what is the size of Sri Lanka compared to India? They're already aware that, and we are the nearest country to them. China can provide financial resources for this port or that project. He said all the right things in that speech, Congress centenary speech in 1985. You look at that, you get a sense, my God, if some of these things had happened, stemming from a party which had 405 seats in the Lok Sabha. I don't think even Nehru had that many seats. But what did they do? Dr. Y.V. Reddy here knows about it much more in terms of the kind of balance of payments crisis that was growing under Rajiv Gandhi's government. By the way, defense expenditure has never risen to 4% of GDP except during Rajiv Gandhi years, 2 years. One was about 3.8, one was 3.9 something. Right now we are at 2%. The muscular politics of the ruling party does not extend to what I think is an adequate amount of expenditure for the defense ministry, and most of our defense expenditure is payment of salaries and pensions, and that's very important, but they also need equipment in today's world. You can't manage without equipment. A lot of fingers are pointed every now and then, whether it is Rajiv Gandhi, whether it is Indira Gandhi or people before them. What were these people thinking? They haven't invested enough in public health or in primary education. I would like to submit to this group that I don't think it's a question of allocation of resources. How many of you, and that includes me, would like to spend a lifetime in a small village trying to work on public health? Which means that you are going to a little public health center where there is somebody who comes who has maybe at most an MBBS, perhaps not even that, and you are trying to work day after day, waiting for medicine to come. It's very difficult. It requires a tremendous amount of optimism about yourself, about your children, about the country. That's why I keep harking back to optimism and cynicism. You as a person have to feel energized. You have to feel, there are people who do that. Whether it's Gandhi, Vinoba Bhave, and there are people, I'm sure, in Andhra Pradesh who have done it. But it's not easy. So that's part of the job of a Prime Minister, to enthuse people to do more than what they would have done in the normal course. To raise that level of national optimism and reduce cynicism, and you can judge for yourself how many such leaders we have today who can raise the level of optimism. So whether it is public health or primary education, I disagree with this trenchant criticism of economists like Pranab Bardhan. I admire him as an economist, but he has tremendous criticism, and not just him, many who come to Delhi and give us lectures about how India today has a level of primary education that China had in 1970. Yes, Mr. Bardhan, but you are on the west coast of California, very good for you, you are bright, you write well. But are you prepared to work in a village for 30 years of your life? I don't think I was, or at least I didn't even understand when I was young that is what is necessary, and millions of people have to do that extension work. That is what a Prime Minister or a Chief Minister or a Minister has to do, enthuse people to rise above themselves. That's what people did during the freedom struggle. The leaders made them rise above their own limited lives and trying to feed themselves and their families and look after their children. It's not easy. That's what leadership is all about. But cut to Narasimha Rao. Many among you here know. I have great admiration for him, because the opportunity presented itself communist Soviet Union had broken up. The die-hard left of center economists, etc., were also feeling a little insecure. Here they've been extolling the virtues of Soviet Union and how it is a much better model than the US model and so on. There is no US model, but that is a better way to go, and suddenly they felt insecure because this country has broken up. You don't want India to break up. And again here, perhaps Dr. Reddy has already spoken to this gathering or in other forums in Hyderabad, because he knows this from his personal experience, the kind of work which was done with the leadership and encouragement of someone like Narasimha Rao, who said, let the technical guys, whether it is Dr. Manmohan Singh or Rakesh Mohan and others, C. Rangarajan, Manmohan Singh, they know what's to be done. He gave them the political cover to do their work. So I have this about him. I mean, Babri Masjid, a mess. And maybe he really did not retire to his room and go to sleep. I think he did it consciously. And today I've got a reminder that perhaps that's how it was. But I will give a little quote about him from my book. He deserves the nation's gratitude for steering the Indian economy out of trouble when it was going through a major crisis. His lasting legacy is that he left behind an economically stronger country than the one he inherited. He had the perspicacity and the tenacity to set in motion an irreversible reform process which has led India on a path of sustained higher economic growth. And if you look at the growth numbers pre-91 and post-91, on average, post-91 is way above what it was pre-91. So we do owe him that debt of gratitude. Because, opportunities come and we miss those opportunities. I have to be careful. My family says, you give me a mic and an audience and I'll just keep talking. So, 10 minutes. Okay, so I'll try and shorten it. Bajpai, another Prime Minister I have great respect for. I'll quote from, because we have 10 minutes and I want to wind up. In one of the, this is a direct quote from the book. In one of the boldest decisions taken by any Indian PM, Bajpai went ahead with the nuclear test in May 1998. I apologize to those of you who feel that India becoming a nuclear weapon power was a mistake. I'll only point you to North Korea. The only reason why it's still a country, I mean, it shouldn't be a country with that mad dictator they have, is because it has nuclear weapons. And the only reason why Saddam Hussein is dead and Gaddafi is dead is because those two countries did not have nuclear weapons. There's no reason to believe that Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi were any more vicious with respect to their own people than the current dictator of North Korea is. That is the hard reality of international relations. So yeah, he took a bold decision even before they had a stable coalition, and he was assisted by a foreign service officer whose name you may not know. And I think I can mention this. They were very close friends, Brajesh Mishra, and he then was his principal secretary. They took this decision. What happened? The whole world turned against India. And I'll give you a little story. A friend of mine called Rakesh Sood, who was a joint secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, went to Moscow. Where do you go? You go to your supposedly good friend, at that time no longer Soviet Union, but Russia. And who was on the other side? They met Primakov, who was the Prime Minister of Russia at that time. This is within a few months of May 1998. And there's Primakov across the table, Brajesh Mishra, Ronen Sen was our ambassador in Moscow. So Primakov gave a lecture to Brajesh Mishra. He was the senior most out of the officials who were there from India. Primakov gave them a lecture on why India had done a tremendously bad thing by going overtly nuclear. And he went on and on and on like this for some time, at which point of time Brajesh Mishra, then Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister, was just about to take over, but known widely as the Prime Minister Vajpayee's right-hand man. He said, but Excellency, what would you want India to do? And Primakov took out a fountain pen and pointed to Mishra and said, "Sign the NPT like this," and he signed it on a piece of paper. Those of you who are not familiar with the NPT, what it does is that 5 established nuclear weapon powers will remain nuclear weapon powers and everybody else has to never become a nuclear weapon power. So Brijesh Mishra got up and said, "Excellency, we have taken up far too much of your time," and left. And that's Russia. So you can imagine what the US did. As it happens, when this happened, I called up a German friend of mine and said, India has gone overtly nuclear and I told you this would happen. You have this is the Indian habit. I told you so, this will happen. But in the World Bank, the US, with its largest shareholding, inconsistent with the World Bank's Articles of Agreement, it took a decision that only so-called humanitarian assistance or loans meant for humanitarian purposes would be freshly signed with India, and some which are already existing in the pipeline will disburse, but nothing else. And this is completely against the Articles of Agreement of the World Bank, because under those articles, no political issue can make the World Bank change what it is doing to help countries to develop. So I'm just giving you a sense of how isolated we became. If Russia is like that, the US has taken a negative attitude, Australia, of course Australia is not a big country, Japan with its experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now you see the Japanese Prime Minister coming to India and he's signing agreements for this fast train between Mumbai and Ahmedabad, and now we hear that perhaps the Shiv Sena, just to spite the Prime Minister, is not going to allow it, and so on and so forth. But be that as it may, those were not days of India-Japan bhai-bhai. Those were days when Japan was seriously reconsidering even disbursements on existing government-to-government loans. So his government, meaning Vajpayee's government, he recognized it's the US that you have to engage, and others will finally fall in line. His government engaged shrewdly with the US to bring relations gradually back to normal. Patching up with the US, yet keeping India out of the Iraq war, was a significant foreign policy success. I'll now very quickly wrap up, and so that there can be some questions. Manmohan Singh will be remembered for Manrega. I think that was a fair thing to do. Yes, some economists were against it because it places or creates pressures on our fisc. But we have to find the money. As somebody said, in India, people don't want to pay their income tax, those who are above the slab below which no tax has to be paid as per law. Indians don't want to pay income tax, but the funny thing is that the government doesn't want to collect income tax. This is a very strange country, because if you are really serious about collecting income tax, we have what? Some 3.2 million people who declare income above 10 lakhs per annum. 10 lakhs per annum, that's, less than a lakh per month. It's not even a joke, it's beyond a joke. So, Manrega, why do I say that with regard to Manrega? So those who are objecting to this, just get on with this business of collecting tax from people. You can just find out. There are so many ways of finding out through expenditures. So governments, successive governments, all governments, particularly now with the IT systems that we have, you can insist that any purchase above this much has to be using plastic or a check. It's a good point, since I'm talking about technology, plastic. The world, where did it start with? The Iron Age. That was the first big technological jump. And then after many, many centuries, I'm not getting into agriculture itself. That's even before Iron Age. Then because of Iron Age, you move to systematic agriculture. Then from there to Industrial Revolution. And now to the information technology and artificial intelligence age. We have to ask ourselves as a people, are we in a position to take advantage of these latest technological innovations? Every time we reach a point at which we say, now is the point, takeoff point for India. And then we seem to sputter and then somehow the engine stops. And there has been so much talk about how the 21st century, or at least the second half of the 21st century, will be the Asian half century, particularly from 2050 onwards. It's so easy to make predictions. I won't be around 2050. The younger people here will be. 2050. From then on, India is going to do fantastically well. Asia will be the dominant continent of the world, even without Japan, because India and China will reach such heights and so on and so on. And we keep hearing this, and I always worry, will we get left behind again? And here I want to, I may sound like a politician, but I say it from the bottom of my heart. Instead of entitlements, we need to empower people. Both words start with E. One, I'm not so sure is the right way to go, to seek to give one more entitlement. Manrega is not an entitlement. I think that is social justice. But empower people. That's the way to go. And the last thing I'll say before I talk about my parents is, we often are fantastic when there is a crisis. We do fantastic crisis management. As we have in 1971, birth of Bangladesh, Mrs. Gandhi showed great character and great ability to maneuver the ship of state through very difficult and shallow and rocky waters. 1991, 1998. But are we good when things are not in a crisis situation? Strategic thinking for the future. To end, my book is dedicated to my parents, who were and continue to be my inspiration. My father, Jaimini Bhagwati, spent 7 years of his youth, in installments of course, in British jails during the freedom movement, and he founded the Tea Garden Workers Movement in Assam. Till today, they have an annual day in which they remember him, because in 1946, thank you. He cycled from, in 1946, he cycled from, in the early part of 46, from Guwahati to Dibrugarh. It's about 330 kilometers. Obviously, he didn't do it in one day. He did it in 6 months, organizing tea garden workers. If you look at the acknowledgement section of the book, Assam is today a part of India because of him. Maybe I'll give you the story. It's an interesting story. The then Prime Minister of Assam was somebody called Gopinath Bordoloi. In those days, Prime Minister Premier. They were called Premier, not Chief Ministers before independence. And he was a little concerned because discussions were going on in Delhi between Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru about which parts of what is today Pakistan, Bangladesh and India would be part of Pakistan or India. And Jinnah was arguing that Assam, with a markedly higher proportion of Muslims than the rest of India, should go to Pakistan. And Nehru was not happy with the idea, but he was getting tired, and Gopinath Bordoloi felt that the only man who can change this was Mahatma Gandhi. So he sent my father, along with one person, to Noakhali, because Gandhi was in Noakhali to quell the communal disturbances there in the winter of 1946. And to cut the long story short, Gandhi looked at them and said, "Is it your view or the view of Assam?" He knew my father personally because he had gone to Tejpur, my hometown, to speak on some other occasion earlier. So the two of them said, no, this is the view of the people of Assam. They want to be part of India, not want to be identified with a country and based on religion. So he then issued a press release which Nehru waved in the face of Jinnah, and Jinnah said, enough, I mean, I'm tired, you can keep all that northeast. So on that thin thread of chance, Assam is today a very proud part of India. Bimal Bhagwati, that's my mother, was a perfectionist. He wrote several books and won a Sahitya Academy Award. And with those words, thank you so much for your patience. You have been an ideal audience. You have waited quietly. Nobody has heckled me. Nobody has thrown a tomato, and nobody has thrown a rotten egg. Thank you so much for your attention.
Good evening. It was a delight listening to your fantastic talk, and what I have read about you, like you have a lot of foreign or international exposure. Sir, politicians today have become a kind of popularly chosen kings, autocrats and dictators, and they have been given the highest power, highest pedestal to decide whatever we are doing. So from the chaprasi to the highest level officer like an IFS officer, we have a qualifying, filtering mechanism, some kind of examination. But I believe politics is one of the only public field where there is no qualification needed there. Why don't we have a filtering exam to filter fishes from crocodiles, and have something like ISPS or INPS, like Indian State Political Service or Indian National Political Service, where we can at least give them a certificate that
India have been friends, and China in fact has been grateful to India for the transfer of knowledge from India to China. Now, with this background, how did the 1962 war happen? Many people blame Nehru for this. So what is the actual...
Assam with India. I generally keep telling two stories about Assam. One, I tell it belongs to China, and another it belongs to India, based on two mythological stories. But today I got another perspective. My question is, tell us something briefly in a minute about the currently 7 sisters were part of Assam, I think, at one point of time.
Years you could not cover. Please, you point. Pardon? Okay. Including NRC.
Okay. Politicians have no qualifying examination because they make the laws, so they make the rules. But we have the vote. So we have to organize ourselves. I don't remember that Urdu couplet. Khudi ko kar buland itna ke khud khuda tujhe puche bande teri raza kya hai. I'm sure I've murdered the couplet, but you get the sense. You make yourself strong enough that even God has to ask you, my dear man, what do you want? Sorry, my dear lady, what do you want? I have to be careful, I have to be gender sensitive. So, so we as voters ultimately have them. We are also susceptible to narrow partisan kind of slogans, I will do this for you. So all that bunch of people go, not realizing that if you are going to get some benefit, somebody else is getting excluded, they are going to get very angry and then they will hit you in some other way. So I think ultimately the common man and the common woman, I turn it around, the common woman does something, the common man will follow. That is the usual thing. So no, I'm not blaming the common women because that would be wrong. But yeah, so I think it is ultimately for us to organize ourselves. I mean, how did people organize themselves before? Not everything has to be politics. I have to give great credit to both Vikram and Ajay. They have created this platform where people are talking and listening to each other, and another point of view is expressed. So we take these kinds of initiatives and make them bigger. So then whoever is in power will have to listen to you. And as long as you say something which is reasonable, it gains even greater currency and resonates around the country. The next point, China and India were friends for 1,000 years, is not exactly correct. There was a lot of interaction. Scholars would come from there. Buddhism traveled to China from India. So, but China was always very center oriented in the sense that the Chinese emperors, and I'm not going to get into the several dynasties because they change in their nature. At one point of time, Mongolia held sway over what is today China, most parts of it. That's why the Great Wall of China, to keep the Mongol hordes out of China. I quote from a declassified note in the Nehru chapter, declassified by the US, a meeting between Nixon, Kissinger, and Chou En-lai. It's very instructive. Go and look at that declassified note. The declassified note I've taken from a publicly available source in the US, because they declassify their documents, I think, somewhat more regularly than we do. I think India should also declassify. Many of my notes, I want them declassified. I want the rest of India. Unfortunately, it can't happen during my lifetime because we have a 30-year rule, which usually becomes a 50-year rule, and even then, government has the right not to declassify on the grounds of national security. If you look at that note, you realize that China has a far-sighted view of what China is all about, that China must dominate in Asia and India must be contained. Because they smart and are irritated with an India which, in 1991, by the way, as recently as 1991, China's per capita income was $50 less than, in 1991 prices, $50 less than that of India. India was somewhere around $380 per capita in 1991. And China was 330, not my numbers, IMF numbers. Just go to IMF, it's open to everyone. Just go to their website and you will get those numbers. So China has always been irritated with an India. In 1950 and 51 and 54, Nehru was like a towering personality all over the globe. The Chinese were very irritated. A, they don't speak English as well as Nehru. And if you look at those declassified minutes, you realize the depth of their angst. They say, oh, discovery of India. I'm sure everybody has read Nehru's Discovery of India, written while he was in jail. Amazing. I mean, hardly any access to any library or anything. Might have asked for a few books here and there. But they refer to Discovery of India as proof that Nehru has set his sights on occupying all of what is today Southeast Asia, etc., etc. I mean, this kind of, they know that it is not right. So China has an idea. I'm not suggesting that it is right or wrong. They feel that they should be the preeminent power in Asia at that point of time in 1971. And this English-speaking fellow who has nothing in his country, he is going around and becoming such a leader all around the world. When Nehru would get up to speak at the UN in New York, people would listen. Because there was a distinction between India as a nation and Nehru as a leader and as a speaker. And they saw him as somebody who had been chosen by Gandhi. Gandhi could have chosen many people. And I give the reason why Gandhi chose Nehru and not somebody else, even though he was elite. I don't know whether you know the story. It's a lovely story. I have gone from China, India to this lovely story about Gandhi, Nehru, and Kasturba at a railway station. In those days, not too many people were flying anywhere. So Nehru had gone to the railway station to see off Gandhi and Kasturba. This is somewhere around 42 or something like that, before Quit India movement and before all of them were jailed. So Kasturba Gandhi says to Nehru some words which were effectively meant, may God be with you. That's like she's older than Nehru and she's kind of blessing him and saying, be safe, may God be with you. And Nehru splutters in anger. He's so irritated, he says, what God? Where is God? Look at Hitler, look at this world in which Jews are being massacred and people are dying in thousands. Is there any God? There is no God. But Kasturba was very shocked with his outburst. She took a step back. Gandhi patted her and said, don't worry, Kasturba. Nehru is far closer to God than what he thinks, or for that matter, how close we are to God, you and I. We take his name every day. He denies God, but he's much closer to God. It's a beautiful story. And by the way, it is documented. I'm not making this up. You will find it. If I remember right, in one of Ram Guha's books, but he's also quoting from a letter from somebody who was personally present. But coming back to China and India, you see, I have heard Xi Jinping in Delhi in the ITC hotel there on Sardar Patel Marg. And my abiding impression after that 1 hour talk, this is his first visit to India when he went to Sabarmati and they're doing this, the two leaders, and I'll come in a moment to Mr. Modi and all, they're sitting in that swing and they're swinging away and they're the best of chums and all that. So there, Mr. Xi Jinping is basically saying, you have to read between the lines. He's not saying it in as many words, but I'm listening to the context and what it implies. I'm getting the sense that they're saying, you Asians, you Indians, you just remain in South Asia. You're not good enough to go anywhere else. So this is the thinking in China for a long time, that if we are going to be the preeminent power, India with comparable population, perhaps fantastic human resources, all here in front of me, it could outstrip us. So we need to keep boxing India back into South Asia. Assam belongs to India or China, 7 sisters and all that. I would submit that if you travel in the Northeast, you will find that the culture and the people, they are like the rest of India, the same. They are not like, they want democracy, they want the fort. I'm not saying that the Chinese people don't, I don't know. But I would say, and as far as the 7 sisters are concerned, they were not all part of Assam at any point of time. There was Nifa, there was Nagaland. Meghalaya, yes, Meghalaya was part of Assam till it separated in the 70s. The point was made about the latest, my talk has not covered Modi. I knew the question would come, so no need, and plus I was told I have 10 minutes left. I start at the beginning of the Modi chapter by saying that, look, his term is not yet over. You need a little distance to be objective. Otherwise, if I just look at Maharashtra, I'll say disastrous behavior of the central government in trying to pressurize, effectively pressurizing the president to lift the president's rule in Maharashtra, and the governor swearing in people at 7:50 in the morning. But I see Modi has done other things. On the foreign policy front, let's begin with the foreign policy. Tremendous energy. He began on a very good note in 2014, inviting all the leaders of the region. I think that was a fantastically smart move. It had not been done before. The swearing in was in the forecourt of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, internationally covered in all the television coverage of the respective countries. All to the good. On foreign policy, I think he relies too much on personal diplomacy. All the hugging which Xi Jinping will not get you great friendship with China. They are hard-nosed people. So is everybody else. Everybody is going to look at their national interest. But I'm sure Prime Minister Modi knows that himself. But there's a certain amount of time and a certain amount of effort to be paid to personal diplomacy. And I personally feel that far too much, and my own foreign service colleagues must be to blame because they love it, these summits, A whole bunch of people go for a preparatory meeting, then they go with the Prime Minister, then they go for a follow-up meeting. So it's all very good. You have the G20, you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have the BRICS gathering. Today it's in Brazil, tomorrow it is in Shanghai. It's too much. So I think he needs to take a step backwards. Earlier we had a foreign minister who did not have his confidence. Now we have Jay Shankar, somebody who was a year junior to me in the Foreign Service, very bright, exceptionally good at his work. Let him do his work and spend more time on our domestic issues. So I think in foreign policy, this personal diplomacy has been carried too far, and Howdy Modi is very good, but they are all doing very well in the US anyway. So, if they like what an Indian Prime Minister is saying, and the Indian Prime Minister walks hand in hand with Trump, I personally think, I was asked on television, and on live television I said that's a bad idea because we have a relationship with the United States, not with President Trump. Tomorrow Mr. Trump might lose. He may win, in which case it works out well. But if he loses, I don't think the Democrats are going to be very happy with all that Howdy Modi and walking hand in hand with President Trump. So I'm trying to generalize. This is all what I call personal diplomacy. Personal diplomacy is good. It's like if somebody comes to your house, you give them a good meal, they'll be happy with you, but they don't suddenly start thinking that you're a fantastic person. They say, he's got money, he's given me a good meal. It is who you are and what you bring to their lives. And in a personal level, you bring something to somebody's life through true friendship. Similarly, between countries, you do it through economic linkages. Ultimately, economic linkages. So to be able to have economic linkages, we must have an economy, which is not sputtering as it is doing now. So that's what it ultimately is. As far, since I'm going, this is a segue to move on to the economy, and then I'll go on to social issues about Mr. Modi. On the economy, I don't think they have the team they need. By team, I'm not getting into the Minister X or Minister Y. They need to have more people who tell them. I have a feeling they perhaps know, but perhaps they don't. That what are the issues? Where are the problems? What did demonetization do? Quietly, there's no need to publicize this. What are the problems with GST? What are the current problems about lack of demand in rural areas? Given your fiscal situation, given the amount of trouble the government is on lower than expected GST collection, now it has to make good for the state governments, because below a certain amount, the central government, where will it make good from? I learned from Dr. Reddy today that companies are waiting for government payments which are due to them for some time. I know that as far as the tax people are concerned, they are withholding refunds to a very large amount, which I will not mention. We don't want any panic here. So I think he doesn't have, prime ministers are not supposed to be economists. They're not supposed to be PhDs in finance. They need to build teams around them who tell them what the true story is, and also then gain acceptance through the prime minister's speeches and other things, where he tells the people, this is what the situation is, this is why the growth has slowed down, and this is what we are trying to do about it. But having said that, I mean, the number of initiatives have happened. I don't think reducing, there might be people here who are of the opinion that reduction of corporate taxes is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not going to solve your problem today. When you have reduced corporate taxation, they don't suddenly start investing. They're going to look at demand. Ultimately, it's demand which drives investment, not the other way around. Investment cannot drive demand. Demand will drive investment. So you have to put money in people's hands. I don't think they get it. But having said that, whether it is the health program, Ayushman Bharat, whether it is the gas cylinders for poorer sections, whether it is Swachh Bharat, these are all good initiatives. I applaud him for that. And you need to keep working for the next 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, people are saying, oh, nothing much has happened because the ladies who got the gas cylinders don't have money to buy another gas cylinder. Maybe true. But still, it's better than zero. Where it is unequivocal, I've talked about economics, I've talked about foreign policy. Where it is unequivocally negative is on social and religious lines. This is a country which through the ages has been, this is what I take pride in India about. We're a tolerant, all-encompassing, all-embracing kind of country. That is the way we should be. And I'm not entirely sure that his party, I'm not going to say it's his view or the view of X or Y or whether it is the RSS view or whatever, don't want to get into that. I think the head of government has to speak up when there are incidents of violence against minorities, even though in a country of this size with the population that it has, some amount of violence will happen somewhere or the other, and there is a tendency for media to overplay it. But again and again, when I hear of violence against minority community, I'm deeply distressed. And you might say, and I will agree with you, that the Prime Minister cannot get up and keep saying, so-and-so was killed, I don't like it. No, but I think we need a sort of a state, an address to the nation, talking on social issues, saying why this party is trying this, some things are happening, and this is wrong, and why he's completely against it. It's not happened to the extent it should have. And I will add that on the legal side, again, I'm not entirely sure that the government has, you'll notice I'm choosing my words carefully, I'm being a diplomat here. I'm not entirely sure, that's what I'm saying to a large group. In a private group, I might tell you that I'm somewhat more sure, that I'm not entirely sure that the government is doing the right thing. I have no other better way of saying it. Whether it is X who's in jail or Y who's being pursued, I somehow get a sense that it's all about political rivalry rather than a significant crime or some issue which needs to be pursued in the way it is being pursued. So he's tremendously popular, otherwise he wouldn't have 300 something seats. But sometimes you have to also look at the means, not just the end. I mean, you know, we all know, we were taught this when we were kids, either by our class teachers or by our parents, that the means are as important as the end. Coming to power is an end that all political parties want, but I think the means by which you come to power are as important if you want to make sustainable changes. And sustainable changes, I mean in a positive sense. And I think the jury is out as far as I'm concerned. I'm not sure that Mr. Modi has met that test in terms of the means that have been adopted to come to power. The last question was on NRC. I'm from Assam, so I have to not defend the government or defend the Supreme Court decision, but I know perhaps a little more about NRC than the average person here, but I will not bore you with details. I'll give you the feedback I get when I go to my hometown, Tejpur. When I talk to people, I said, what are people really concerned about? And I'm here talking about cross-section of Assamese. By the way, there is no anti-Muslim feeling in Assam of those Assamese who are in Assam for the last so many 100 years. Because those of the minority communities, including the Muslims, they celebrate Bihu. Bihu, I don't know whether you are familiar with this, is a harvest festival. The Muslims, women of Assam wear the same clothes as the Hindu women of Assam. So this has been relatively, have you heard of riots that you've had in UP or in communal riots or in Punjab during the partition and so on in Assam? No. And we have a much higher percentage of... The Delhi massacre was actually tribals versus outsiders. There's a problem with people trying to foist their language on the Assamese. It's a cultural issue, not a religious issue. And that is why the Assamese people are against this new legislation which will allow refugees of all religions from our surrounding countries to come to India except Muslims. So the Assamese are against that. They are saying, you know, please, not into Assam. We don't want any more people coming. And to give you a concrete example of why the Assamese are upset, I'm less upset, but I live in Delhi. So to that extent, I'm not representative of how people feel. The example is the Mongoldoy Lok Sabha constituency in 1971. If it had X number of eligible voters, in the 1977 elections, you might recall that elections took place after 6 years because of the emergency, it became 1.6x voters. Now, you can't have a 60% increase in the number of voters in 6 years. Because in those days, the voting age was 21. Even if people had raised the number of children, those children would not reach the voting age in 6 years. So there was a tremendous sense of angst about how some other people are coming in, and the usual finger is pointed to Bangladesh. It's only a matter of time when the per capita income social and health indicators of Bangladesh will outstrip that of India, and that will be a natural kind of reason for less people coming from there. But so that is what set it all off. And then you had the 1985 Accord. I'm not even getting into the IMDT Act that Mrs. Indira Gandhi changed. She changed that IMDT Act by which earlier it was the before 1984, it was the responsibility of the person to prove if he or she was challenged why he or she is an Indian national. From there onwards, under the change of that act, Mrs. Gandhi, obviously looking at the votes of a particular community, made it important, or made it necessary for government to prove that X or Y is not an Indian national. All this is by way of background. But at this stage, we need to be humane about it. I mean, somebody who's already here for 10, 20, 30 years. Assam Accord, by the way, said 71. Because Bangladesh agreed to 71. They said, anybody who came to India before 71, we didn't exist. They said, Bangladesh didn't exist as a country. How can you hold us responsible for somebody who came before 71? Okay, post 71, we are responsible. If you can prove to us that Mr. X, Mrs. Y, Miss so-and-so came to India after 71, we'll take them back. And I think the Bangladeshi consulate in Guwahati has issued about 112 residency permits and passports to people who have been proven to have come to India post 71. But 100 and whatever it was is not going to solve the problem. I think the humane thing is to perhaps give them voting rights over a period of time. Do not ask looking at it. I don't know finally, given the Supreme Court's order of 2005, you might have seen that the NRC coordinator has been thrown out of Assam, and now he's being accused of corruption. I mean, the usual thing. So it's not just politicians. Somebody said about politicians, this NRC coordinator is an administrator. I don't know whether he's from the IS or the PCS, that means the Assam Pradesh Civil Service. So that's my long answer to you, that the word is humane. Let's be humane about how you deal with this situation. Somebody who's been living here, I was traveling from Guwahati to Tejpur by hiring a car. And I asked the driver, I could make out from his name. I said, where are you from and where are you living? He said, my parents came from what is today Bangladesh. So I said, where in Bangladesh? He said, I don't know. I was born here. They came from Bangladesh. So I was born here. I don't know what to do. Where do I go? I don't even know where to go because they were so poor. I don't know which village or where they came from. And look at the human problem. He's a hard-working chap. He's driving me from here to there, taking me back to Guwahati airport. I don't think it makes sense. He didn't say it as a complaint. He says, you want me to go back? Where do I go? Where in Bangladesh? I don't know where my relatives are. Nobody knows that I was born here. So under these circumstances, I think there are ways in which we have to behave as a humane, caring country, which is, I think, far more important than having the per capita income of Luxembourg, which is something like $90,000 per capita.
Friends, as you would have realized,
on the Indian and Pakistani side, had the best chance for setting right India-Pakistan relations in the last 70 years.
I think this is their best chance to be on the cover together.
Or sort of, a gallery of all up. It looked too strange. So precisely the reason you mentioned, the first and the last. It's the kind of thing, that's all. And within the book, I don't have photographs of any PM, including Mr. Modi or Nehru. I only have cartoons. Look at the cartoons carefully, and at the start of every chapter, I have a quotation. Look at that quotation carefully. Look at the cartoon in Modi's chapter, and look at the quotation from the Bhagavad Gita at the beginning of his chapter. You will understand a lot from just looking at those two things. What was your second question? It's about when was it possible. You see, Pakistan is an artificial construct because they chose to become a country based on a religion. That's not what human beings do. Religion is an important, but it is not the only part of a human being's life. Religion is between you and your God, whoever it is. It's for me, a very, very private, an intensely private matter. It should not come anywhere. Not immediately in 47, but later on they call themselves the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So that kind of thinking which stems from insecurity means that never ever, despite the innumerable rounds of talks, has there been any good point where you could be confident that we could have resolved our issues? Yes, under pressure, and I refer to that in my book, in my chapter on Indira Gandhi, that post 71 and 72, she made the mistake of believing Bhutto when he said the moment he goes back he'll be hung, as it happened in 1979, they hanged him anyway. So if he agrees to resolve the boundary issue. Now, so it is, and so we have to understand and be patient. Maybe we need to wait 2 more generations, no, not even 1 generation. Just be patient. Try and keep some amount of trade and movement of people going back and forth. But any kind of resolution, because Post Bangladesh, they hold it against us. They say, this country called India has broken us into two. They don't want to look into themselves and look at Yahya Khan's behavior. You don't have to believe me. Read the book called The Blood Telegram by Gary Bass. Archer Blood was the US Consul General in Dhaka. Consul General because it was East Pakistan. He can't be ambassador. So he talks about the genocide there, and Edward Kennedy came to India, went to the refugee camps. And he went back and he gave interviews to New York Times. So this country called Pakistan has lapsed again and again and again into military dictatorships. Right now, ostensibly, we have a fast bowler as the Prime Minister. All good luck to him. But between us, I think we can safely say that Mr. Bajwa, the head of the Pakistani army, calls the shots. So it's very difficult to shake hands with a clenched fist, as has been said many times. But in the meantime, while we can't shake hands, we don't have to have a situation where consular access is not given. We have the Kartarpur corridor. All this is good. We can keep doing that, try and do more people-to-people contacts. Of course, this government believes that people-to-people contacts means some people from there will come and mount another 26th November attack on us. Well, that's the risk you have to take. You have to get your security agencies to be careful. So I personally don't feel it's possible with the kind of animosity they feel towards us. And this I say because I've interacted with a lot of Pakistani senior government officials. It's always very civilized when they're having a drink or something. But there is an inherent kind of angst about us that we broke up their country, and they want to break up India to the extent that they would like to slice off a part of India which is known as the Srinagar Valley and take it, if we can't do much to again get Bangladesh back to our fold. Very frankly, I don't know what people were thinking when you have one country separated by this huge distance. It is not a workable situation anyway. But yeah, so that's my somewhat long answer to your short question.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah. Well,
Sir,
last question and we are done.
Accept accession of Tibet by China.
Okay, so you're going back to the 1954 trade and transit. Firstly, we did not have the military power to do anything about it. I don't know whether you've read enough about the Korean War, but in a subsequent conversation between Mao and Nehru, as you know, well over 1 million Chinese died in the Korean War. So in that context, in some conversation between Nehru and Mao, Nehru asked him about his concern about the US was already a nuclear weapon power. It had used nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said, well, they used nuclear weapons, 20 million dead, Chinese dead. That's all right. I'm prepared to accept that kind of loss. So the Chinese, after their long march, after 48, was in a much stronger position militarily than India. There's no way that Nehru is going to risk an armed confrontation over Tibet, particularly given the difficult terrain over which our Indian army, the British did not want to confront China on that. It was some kind of a modus vivendi. So since we cannot confront them militarily or over Tibet, the thing is, did he extract enough of a concession from the Chinese for having agreed implicitly, not explicitly, through that trade and transit agreement to the inclusion of Tibet in China? My own sense is Nehru did not strike a hard enough bargain, and he should have, at a minimum, at a very minimum, got the Northeast. Now, right now, they staple visas of people coming from Arunachal, and they won't give them visas because they are Chinese citizens, and all this kind of nonsense would not have happened.